Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this Ask the Expert session about living with spina bifida and negotiating transition. This session was preceded by a webinar on this topic held on August the 7th. My name is Judy Thibodeau, and I am SBA's National Director of Research and Services. We are joined tonight by my colleague, Juanita Panliner, SBA's National Resource Manager. I want to mention a few things before we get started. You will remain muted throughout the session, but we want your input. Please submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. We will do our best to address all questions submitted today, as well as questions which were asked during the information session in August, earlier this month. We are recording today's session. Everyone who registered for this event will receive a link to the recording. Closed captioning is enabled. The chat function will be available today. If comments are made that are inappropriate or disrespectful, they will be deleted. Thank you for your help with this. If you have any technical issues, please email Juanita Panliner, JPANLENER@SBAA.org. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jennifer Queally. Dr. Queally is a clinical neuropsychologist and a member of the Spina Bifida program team at Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Queally.
Great. Thank you so much. I don't need to tell you guys anything more about what I do. We can go to the next slide. So I think we're going to start with a few questions that came up at the very end of our the lecture that was a few weeks ago. One of the questions, and I get this question a lot, is around executive dysfunction. And just so that it all makes sense, when people are going back to the recording and everybody knows what I'm talking about, I'm going to read the question and then try to address the question so that they all go together, because several of our slides have multiple questions on them. Okay. So the first question was, what is the logic behind assuming that each person with spina bifida has executive dysfunction? Isn't a lot of what we discussed in that first session applicable to every child as they grow up? So without rehashing everything we talked about during that hour, I wanted to say, in short, yes. And a lot of what I talked about during the last presentation on both the development of functional independence skills and executive functioning skills in general do apply to all young adults. I think that there's a vast amount of literature that talks about how executive functioning skills really don't come fully online for young adults of any background until early 20s, which is why, for example, our age where you're allowed access out to alcohol in the United States is so late, because we want for that part of the brain to develop. I think one of the other things that's really important about executive functioning skills is that they're built on a circuit, meaning our brain needs to be working well as a system for those executive functioning skills to work well. So for all young adults, this is a risk because of what's going on. I think the reason that it comes up so often with spina bifida and with some of the other medical conditions that I work with is that there's more risk involved, and any stressor on the executive functioning system can cause it to not function very effectively. So if you're in pain, if you're experiencing symptoms like nausea, double vision, if you are exhausted because you haven't been sleeping, anything along those lines, you haven't been eating very well, you had a fall, any of those things can affect your executive functioning skills, in addition to things like emotional functioning. So knowing that we have those risk factors, anyone that has a major medical condition that carries with it different types of physiological symptoms would be more at risk. But I think above and beyond that, for many patients with spina bifida, they have had some type of change in brain development. Many patients have had neurosurgery, and those types of things also raise your risk for the potential of difficulties with executive functioning skills. There's no guarantee. We don't have a perfect profile that we expect from every single patient with spina bifida, and I think that's one of the great things about spina bifida is that there's so much variability, that every individual is truly themselves. They have their own strengths and weaknesses they've inherited from their parents. There's just an additional set of risk factors that come with some of the early changes that they experienced in medical treatment. That being said, I think one of my mantras during the last talk was that routines are helpful, and that's universal for all young adults and adults. That's how we function on a regular basis. The second question asks if that notion that every child and adult has executive functioning skills or dysfunction conflict with the philosophy they should be treated equally and challenged to achieve anything they want. This may be my own bias just as a neuropsychologist, because I feel my job or my professional responsibility is to help everyone function at the best of their abilities. Is that knowing what your risks are and knowing what's hard for you or easy for you as an adult can only help you be more successful. So I know, for example, that when I get stressed out, my memory system does not work as well. I can't encode as rapidly, and I don't chunk and organize things as well. So I'm a list maker because I know personally about myself that that's how my brain works. And I know that if I get stressed, I'm going to forget stuff that I shouldn't forget. And so I tend to write things down. And I'm old, so I write instead of typing. But these things help me. The checklists help me, and they help me kind of keep track of everything that I need to be doing. And so if we know what our potential risks are or what our potential difficulties are, then it's important for us to have a plan and a backup plan to know to do things. So if we know that when we get stressed, we lose track of schedules or we don't manage time very well, then this is a backup plan that we should have in place so that we can support the independent functioning of the young adult, as opposed to expecting failure and not supporting them, if that makes sense. I think some of this goes along with the next slide, Juanita, if you can forward it. This addresses the idea of the dignity of risk, and to give everyone just a definition of what those words mean. And I'm reading this from the Wikipedia website, but it says the dignity of risk is the idea that self-determination and the right to take reasonable risks are essential for dignity and self-esteem. And so they should not be impeded by excessively cautious caregivers who are concerned about their duty of care. I think I started to try and address this at the end of last session and realized that we could probably have a full hour-long conversation about this topic. But the question that came in was what is my perspective about this and the idea behind it, and fostering the development of creative problem-solving skills. I think one of the things that I really tried to convey, and perhaps I didn't do so as well as I had hoped during my last talk, is that the development of functional independence skills happens in tandem with parents backing off or allowing the young adult to have more responsibility. It has to happen together, because otherwise we won't see the development to true potential for any young adult. And this is one of the things that I spend a lot of time negotiating in my clinic visits with families, is how do we allow adolescents, preteens, tweens to start taking responsibility for their day-to-day actions, for their behaviors, for their medical regimens, so that we can see how independent they can be and provide additional support when necessary so that they can become as independent as possible. I 100% agree that we have to allow patients an everyday life experience to their potential. And this includes sometimes making mistakes, sometimes not choosing what our parents would have chosen for us. I'm pretty sure every single person on the call can give a couple of examples of things that their parents wish they had done differently. And I think that in order to live a healthy, fulfilled, independent life, that's essential. However, from the parent's perspective, the potential risks are scary. And I think one of the things that is very hard, especially when I start these conversations in the early teen years, is for an adolescent to understand that when they failed to catheterize for the first 2 days, that their parents let them do it independently or something along those lines, that fear, that potential risk to health is, as I would say, traumatizing to some parents. And it's hard to get over that with one conversation or one argument, which is what sometimes happens with adolescents. It's a building of trust over time. And this is part of why during my talk and in general in my clinical care, I feel like we have to start these conversations as early as possible. It's very hard to have a conversation with a 20-year-old and tell the parents, like, back off, let the 20-year-old do everything independently with no support from you, if that's not how life has been up until that moment. It's a gradual progression of kind of taking more responsibility. I think one of the areas where this gets really challenging is if the parents have grave concerns about decision-making capacity and guardianship is involved, because then even with the opportunity to make some choices and decisions legally, the parents maintain decision-making powers in certain situations. And again, guardianship is different in every state. And there's a variety of different supports we can do instead of guardianship. But I think that this is variable depending on independent functioning. I think the second piece addresses some of this, which is what are the best ways to support a family member who's now a young adult, who's not yet found their place in society or are lacking confidence? Because I feel like the best way to build confidence is through success. And sometimes success is not an entire massive project, but it's smaller bits of it. Because once we feel confident that we can do all the parts, it's much easier for us to do the entire task. So for example, with catheterization, I start extremely young with toddlers, and when their parents are cathing them, to go through all the steps out loud when they're cathing them, so that the kids can repeat the steps back by the time they're 3 or 4, so that they know if someone's cathing them and they miss a step. And then we take over, like the first step, we wash our hands together. And then the second step, we sanitize, like to go through the process and gradually assume responsibility for it. Because if you've done it 1.2 million times, by the time you're telling your parents to back off and let you be independent, it's much easier to trust that task is going to be completed. And it's easier for parents to feel safe, that their kids are going to be successful and not harm themselves. The conversation of like, where is the kind of precipice of risk that's allowed? Where is that pinpoint turn between this is extremely risky for patients and their children versus this is a growing experience, I think is slightly different for all patients. And sometimes that has to do with the level of medical complexity that the young adult has had. I also feel like these should be ongoing conversations throughout life, not just one conversation ever. Can we go to the next slide, Juanita? I'm mindful of the fact there's a lot of questions. Okay, so finding adult care. How can you find the right doctor as an adult with spina bifida? I think that we can talk about how do you find the right doctor as an adult as a general concept. I think it's very important that patients have an understanding of what they feel is important from doctors. So for example, do you mind if your doctor is typing on a computer and not making eye contact with you during a visit? Do you mind that your doctor is the same gender as you or not? Do you mind if the doctor is considerably older than you? Would you like someone with more experience, or would you prefer someone younger? What kinds of things appeal to you? What kinds of things make you uncomfortable? And those are some of the factors we should be thinking about when choosing a doctor. I think one of the most important things in finding a primary care doctor is twofold. One is that they're in the system that you need. So for most of our patients, they'll go on needing urological care, perhaps PMR or rehab medicine or orthopedic surgery. We might need a neurosurgeon. And so we're looking for a hospital system that has those specialties. Finding a physician that works within the system allows for better coordination of care, even especially if you can't find an adult-based clinic, which I find extremely challenging to find, even harder than finding a neuropsychologist. I talk about finding therapists in this way, but I often use the analogy of like getting a haircut, that if you go for a haircut and it doesn't feel good, you don't like the haircut, it's a terrible haircut, you have 2 choices. Well, 3, I guess you could hide at home and never leave the house again. But the 2 viable choices are you go back to the person who cut your hair and you tell them that they did a terrible job and you ask them to fix it. Or the second option is you go to someone else and you ask them to fix your hair, but you don't never get another haircut. So if it's not going well, if you feel uncomfortable, if there's something that doesn't work for you, being able to have an open conversation and say, I feel like I need more of this. I need you to be more open in your communication. I need you to be more specific in your notes. I need us to review at the end of every session what we need to do next. Whatever it is that appeals to you or that you feel you need to be able to have an open discussion with your physician. And if it doesn't work or the physician says, I can't do that, I don't practice in that way, then we know it's time to move on. In following suit, the next question asks about like, how do we get the same medical care, like therapy that we had for a child that's now considered to be an adult? Again, I live in the Boston area. We're very lucky in that we have access to a lot of different services. But one of the things that I think is most important is to always find the goal. What do we need the service for? And that makes it easier for us to find the right service provider. So if we want to continue with occupational therapy, because hand strength is an issue, come up with a list of practical everyday things that's hard. And then we go to our insurance company and say, this is what I think I need. Or we go to our primary care doctor. And then we ask what therapists in our local area would be covered for this service. I think what gets hard is when we say more general things, like I'd like to have occupational therapy because I had it before and I liked it, which may be fair, but your insurance company is not going to be super pumped to spend lots of extra money because something was enjoyable to you before. So we want to make sure that we find something, a goal that we want to work towards. And most therapy, whether it's psychological therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, is very goal driven. So what are the goals? And when we attain the goals, we graduate from therapy temporarily. And so it may be that we need to work on transfers because you got a different size vehicle and we need to get in and out of a different size vehicle. So we need to work on transfers for a bit. And then once we figure it out, we don't need to continue with physical therapy. But so I do feel like finding like-minded clinicians through that PCP can be really helpful. The other secret way is I use a lot of our state-based agencies to find referrals, whether it's through other patients or families that are involved in the state-based agencies or the providers who run those. So for most of our young adults, once they leave the school system, they might be involved in voc rehab. There might be a state-based agency that does advocacy work. And those are sometimes good resources above and beyond your local Spina Bifida Association to find some of these therapists. And so neuropsychologists are similar. There are neuropsychologists everywhere. It's just a matter of finding them. You're more likely to find a neuropsychologist at a hospital than you are in the community, particularly one that specializes in medical conditions. So that piece is important. I think the second piece to think about is why you want a neuropsychological assessment, because that helps sometimes find the specialist that you're looking for. So in the adult medical centers, there's some neuropsychologists that specialize more on aging. So, do we have symptoms of Alzheimer's? Are we having memory loss that we didn't have before? And then there are some that are more focused on kind of crucial medical symptomology that's occurring in the moment due to a medical condition, or even accommodations to go back to school or in the workplace environment, et cetera. And those are sometimes two different sets of clinicians. But for example, the adult hospital that's next to us has neurosurgery, neurology, and neuropsychology all together in the same service. And so the neurosurgeon or the neurologist, whoever is following you, would be a good person to use as a referral source. Your insurance company should also have a list, but sometimes we don't find everything we need from them. Try the next slide. Okay, so challenges with self-care and management. What tools would you give an 18-year-old moving away to college to make sure they do their daily bowel, calf care, and take all their medications? Okay, so what tools could I give? So this really depends, again, on our own personal strengths and weaknesses. I think for all young adults going to college, one of the hardest things is the open-ended time. So very differently from high school, you set up a schedule and you might have classes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, a couple times a day, and then have nothing on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So your schedule every day is changing. You're highly scheduled one day, not scheduled the next. That's when we tend to fall apart with our routines. So if that's what we know is hard for us, then we want to find some way to schedule our unscheduled time, whether it's using an app whether it's using a daily routine that we get up and go to the library at the same time we would go to class, so that it's the same exact routine that we would normally engage in. Those things are very helpful in supporting the engagement of routines. And it's like that for us, like everyone. And I want to keep emphasizing this. All of us do better with routines. My eating schedule is so much more regimented when I'm at work and I have a small window, sometimes 5 minutes to eat my lunch. It's very different on the weekends when I have a lot more flexibility. And I might eat 2 hours late on the weekends because that's what worked for me. That doesn't work if you've got a time sensitive medical issue like taking a medication or something along those lines. So what I try to do is build routines as much as possible. There's actually a number of amazing apps that have been created. Some of them are geared towards geriatrics, which means they have larger font and are somewhat embarrassing, but you can usually fidget with them to make them less embarrassing and more useful, where they interfere with the use of your phone until you check off that you've done it. They might have a picture of the pill that pops up that reminds you to do it. It might be a timer system where you have to go through and complete it in order to do that. But I think the best way to do it is to not rely on switching in the moment where we're actively working on something and we have to stop, urgently get up and go do something, but to build in a 15, 20-minute window that's in our schedule every day so that that's the time that's allocated. So we're not having to displace another activity. That piece I feel like is really important. Oh, I'm sorry. The other thing that I would think about with the daily bowel routines is what's going to work best given our current schedule. So in high school, we oftentimes do bowel routines at night, right before bed, or we do them first thing in the morning. And in college, sometimes our schedule is very different, right? Like on Tuesdays, we may not start until 10, but on Mondays, we may start at 8 or something along those lines. And again, it's important for us to keep the same daily routine. I feel like most bowel routines, when you start playing with the time of day that you're doing them, you have varied success for the next day. But it's too much time since your last clean out or et cetera. And if you're going to do it a couple times a week, I would plan for the times where you have more flexibility in your schedule rather than less, so you have a little bit more time if you need it. I believe in planners, and I'm old, so I like paper planners where you can see them, but younger people can use Outlook, Google, whatever it is that you want to use for a calendar, and break down all your time. And I think this works well for scheduling, studying time, writing time, rehearsal time, meeting with other people, going to clubs and activities, and making sure that we do all of the things that we're supposed to be doing as college students. And so one of the things we should be doing is taking care of our bodies. So making sure that we are done with enough time to get 8 hours of sleep before the next day, et cetera. And if we can come up with a little schedule and get into a routine, I find that most of my young adults are much more successful. This seems like a much more specific example or question. Our adolescent son refuses to exercise, do push-ups in his chair to relieve his skin, is irregular in his cathing, and does not wash his hands properly. And it sounds like at this point, because of these challenges, he's starting to get sick, right? He's having UTIs that are having a lot of symptoms. So how can we respect his agency while encouraging him to take care of himself? So what I would recommend is that we prioritize one area that we want to work on so that we're not working on 30 things at the same time, because that often feels overwhelming. And one of the things that I typically find most successful is to kind of go through and think through the entire task out loud and try and figure out what's in the way. So one example, I work a lot with our renal specialists around water consumption and patients who aren't drinking enough water. And we start to kind of pull apart, like, is it that we're worried about having to cath down the road? Is it that our water bottle is not big enough? Is it that by the time we get to drink the 78th ounce of water or whatever it is of the day, that it's like warm and disgusting? Like, what is it that's getting in the way of us being more successful? Do we forget? So for all of those, there's different interventions. If we know we're going to have to cath more, or we might leak, we drink too much water, then we need to plan another catheterization. But if we don't address the problems down the pike, it's very hard for us to engage in the behaviors right now. So for this particular person, refusing to exercise is a normal young adult and adult thing. I'm not so great at always exercising. But doing the push-ups in his chair to relieve his skin is something different. That's a body shift every half an hour, 20 minutes, whatever it is. And so that might be an easier one to start on. How do we remember to do that? Is it a timer on our watch? Is it after every TV show? Is it after every fortnight game? Whatever it is that he's engaging in, where there's a cue to remember to do it. The other thing we can do is work on specific skills to try it. So if we forget to move, then we get a cue that we need to make sure that we check our skin later. And checking our skin later might be extremely inconvenient and hard and challenging. And so then the actual skin movement during the day is much more beneficial because there's a trade-off. So those are things to think about. The other thing is to make sure that our idea of a task completion is fully conveyed to the other person. So I like things that have routines because it means that we do it in the same way every time. So you can sing Row, Row Your Boat, you can sing the ABCs, you can count to 30, but all of those things give you the amount of time that you should be washing your hands with soap. But you should also be washing the backs of your hands and the fronts of your hands and your nails underneath your nails if they're longer. And so those kinds of things. So we stick our hands in mud and we work on getting it all off till we can like rehearse the physical activity that we need to do. How much do we have to push ourselves out of our chair to make sure that our skin gets a breather? Is it a little? Is it all the way out? Do we have to extend fully? Does it have to be for a few seconds? Kind of pulling apart all of the different behaviors that we're expecting and seeing what it is. Maybe the cushion on his wheelchair doesn't allow him enough space to just push up and he has to like actually move around. And that's when things get hard because of balance. Like there's a variety of different things that might be getting in the way. But I think the best way to do it is to take every single little activity and to tease apart all the different real steps of the task and to start thinking about which one might be getting in the way. And then to talk a little bit about wanting him to be independent so he can live on his own. And the trade-off is we want to make sure that we can see his engagement in these behaviors at this time. And if you need ongoing support and kind of problem solving, this is where a psychologist or a social worker may be helpful in setting weekly goals and taking it out of the parent's hands. So working with a third person who's not as personally invested, not that we're not invested in our patient's success, but it's not the same as a parent needing to take over and maintain safety. So having somebody else every week to go through like, okay, now he did what you asked him to do. You need to back off a little bit or give him this reward, or you failed to do what you promised your parents you were going to. Can you understand why they're concerned that you're not taking care of yourself as well as you could? And so that can be really helpful on a time limited basis to work on some of these skills in general. I would also say that sometimes we don't see the connection, and this is with all people, right? That if I eat cake every day at lunch, I don't gain 50 pounds overnight. But if I eat cake every day at lunch at the end of the year, I might have put on 50 pounds. So sometimes it's hard to see the connection between our behavior and the consequences of it. And so thinking about how these things may be more connected in terms of education can also be helpful, particularly when it comes from other people, not our parents. No one wants to hear from their parents how they're doing everything wrong. The best way to encourage a young adult with spina bifida to continue their self-care and to see how important this is. I think some of this comes from positive feedback in our environment. And this goes back to the conversations we were having before about self-confidence and dignity, exposure to our environment. So if we're getting positive feedback from others, not just our parents, about our appearance, how we're doing a better job of exercising, if we're going to a gym and working with a trainer who sees us increase our strength every month, those types of things can often provide positive feedback that helps encourage ongoing engagement of routines. But the other piece is that we as the scaffolders, especially with children and with adolescents, is thinking about how we're setting up the expectations for them to do it and what routines may be shifting or changing. So for a young adult who is very good at their routines when they're in high school and then leaves high school to go home to an unscheduled day, might be really hard to make that transition without some additional scaffolding. So to offer and ask, like, are there things I can do to better support you? As opposed to saying, I think you've done a terrible job and are failing here. And it's very hard. I'm also parenting children. Like, I think it's extremely hard sometimes to provide feedback. It's in a positive, encouraging way that doesn't sound accusatory, especially when we're worried about their safety or their judgment. All right, so what are indicators of a successful transition from pediatric to adult care? So I could spend hours talking about this. I think that The main indicators that we're looking for that we've had a successful transition is that we feel safe in the care of our new providers. We know who to go to with what concern. So when do I go see the doctor? When do I set up an appointment? And how do I do that? Knowing that information and feeling confident in that, I think is really important. But I also feel like some of this is the assumption of independence in these visits as much as we possibly can. So in pediatric care, I think that we as pediatric providers tend to gear towards the parents. We ask the parents questions. We've been working with them for 15, 20 years by the time they leave our care. The adult world starts with interacting with the young adult. And that's a very different perspective. And I feel like being successful with that transition means that the young adult is taking the onus in their visits much more so than they were in pediatric care. You go to the next slide. All right, so clinical perspectives on transition. I'm in a huge facility. My vision is a transition clinic 1 to 2 days a week. I would love that. How do I schedule or organize patients so that they want to take time for transition appointments? So I think there's a few things. One thing that I have found is that when I am honest with my patients and we talk about transition to adulthood, taking over our responsibilities at 18, and then transfer of care between pediatrics and adult care. When I start to go through some of the responsibilities that we expect for adults to see, and that adults will need to be successful in that adult care system, like scheduling their own appointments, knowing the frequency of their visits, I often find if I run through some of those questions, that young adults realize like, oh, I haven't really thought about that. One of the things I think our pediatric clinic does a great job in is like coordinating all of their care. We'll call families. We've set up 8 appointments and 2 diagnostic tests and everything's organized for them. And that does not exist in the adult world. It doesn't happen in the same way. And so working with people to understand how the care is different in different facilities, I think is important. And I love the idea of group models where there's transition clinics and there's, either basic education or everyone in the clinic is working towards the same thing that day. How do we address the young adult primary and not address the parents? How do we bring up the questions and concerns that they have? Are there measures that we can use? Got transition, the track measure. There's one specific to spina bifida. There's the KKIS, which came out of Kennedy Krieger, but all of these look at the development of functional independence skills in a medical setting. They allow for the development of goals and a specific plan to address patient needs. What are effective methods of communication with transitioning patients, age and stage specific? So I can't say that all individuals with spina bifida are individuals and then say that there's a best way to do anything at any age. But what I have found in general is like my general tendencies as an old lady are not the tendencies that I find in my young adults. So I like to call and talk to humans when I schedule appointments. I like to have my little calendar open while I'm talking to a human. I do not find that my young adults prefer to do that. I think that they prefer to send me a text message at 3 o'clock in the morning, which the portal allows them to do. And it's a very different methodology in terms of how things are being set up and how things come most comfortably to young adults. They've definitely grown up in a computer era that was not the same for me. I think I had my first computer in middle school, so that tells you guys how old I am. I feel like communication happens in multiple ways. We have to think about the verbal communication that we give in visits. How clear are we? How well do our patients understand the information that we're giving them? How well do they understand the plan that's coming next? And I often think that written communication is the most effective way because we can go back and reference it. I find that if I put my notes in the portal and patients can access them, both immediately following my visit and prior to the next visit, it helps to get everybody on the same page about what I was doing and what they were doing in between our 2 visits to get prepared. That being said, I feel like all patients work a little bit differently. Some want text messages, some want emails, some prefer phone calls. And so knowing how to do that is actually one of the things that we're charged with as clinicians, that we have to identify how patients learn information best. And I know that some people think that not everybody needs a neuropsychological assessment, and maybe they don't. Although I kind of feel like everybody should get one at some point in their life, not just people who have major medical conditions. But knowing how you accept information best, how it best gets into your brain, is really essential for sharing that with your medical team so that everybody's working with you in the way that you learn best. In terms of successful tracking and follow-up methods with transitioning patients, I think there's a couple of different things that we want to make sure. One is that everybody's getting access to the same supports, whether they find them helpful or not. So for example, I spend 10 minutes going over with all of my patients what the portal is, how we use it, why it's helpful, and different ways that they can use the portal. So maybe they're regular users of the portal and they like to look up their bills and schedule appointments and send their clinical care team information. Or maybe they would prefer to only use the portal when they're on vacation in Florida and, the bottom part of their wheelchair fell off and got stuck in an amusement park ride or something along those lines, to where they can pull up everything that they need to know in the portal, and they can show someone in an emergency room, like, this is the information you need to know. But having someone understand what they have access to and what they're capable of doing gives them power, which allows for more independence. And this stuff is scary. Like, I think the insurance companies are hard to talk to, and I'm a provider. It's really hard to call when you don't even know what you're really asking for. So the more information, the more guidance we can give young adults on like how to do things, I think is really important. So I have little sheets that we've created that look at like how you call a DME company, how you call to fill your prescription, like how do we go through the steps of doing these things. And once we've done it a couple of times, we have a routine, we can be more independent. And again, these things can be helpful for anyone, but for patients with major medical conditions where their health is reliant upon much more engagement with the medical system, it's much more important that they're specifically taught these skills. What other important discussions besides those identified by the transition readiness questionnaires? I think that there's a few things that I always ask that I don't always see on the questionnaires that I use. And most of these have to do with self-advocacy. I had one patient who came into the hospital multiple times, extraordinarily sick. And she was a pretty smart young woman. She had a cell phone. She was able to call and ask for help, and she didn't. And we were really struggling as a clinical team to figure out why. Like, why wouldn't she take ownership to do things? And we started, like I said a few minutes ago, to kind of break apart and look at the actual specific task demands. So when I asked her, like, if you have an emergency, what do you do? She very easily could be like, oh, you call 911. And I was like, well, what do you tell them when you call 911? Dead silence. Looked at me like I had three heads, had no idea. No one had ever talked about that. Like, we're never taught that. Now, the operator might ask questions, which helps us. But if we tend to be anxious, like not knowing what to do is going to limit our engagement. And so the survey questions often will ask, are you capable? Do you do? But they don't look at things like anxiety, fear, lack of experience as the why. And I think that part of the why is so important. I can make a phone call with somebody during a clinical visit to practice making visits. Why don't we do that together? That makes sense. That's a clinical care objective. That's something that we can do as a team. So how do we think through what the barriers are and uncover what the barriers are for each individual patient? Because it's often different. Next slide. All right. Adulting. I love this word. I think a lot of people would rather not adult. And then some people are ready really early. So what resources or suggestions on finding truly accessible housing or negotiating with landlords to have adaptations to apartments for kitchens and bathrooms? Okay, so this is a really complicated question because unfortunately zoning laws and things like that are specific to states. There is a federal like housing agency that has a state-based agency in each state that can help with some advocacy. But some of it is knowing the local laws in your area so that they can be enforced. I think that, again, I will often go back to the state-based agencies that my patients are referred to, as well as some of our local advocacy groups. So like in the state of Massachusetts, we have the Federation for Children with Special Needs. It's a parent kind of focused advocacy group for young adults, and it's a good way to get connected with other people. They have lectures on transitioning. They have, access to different types of supports, and they're often a good resource to call to find out, like, where might I find this type of support. Your local Spina Bifida Association can also help with that. But some of what we really have to do is to think through what we actually need in order to ask for it. And what I found is, even if the hallways are wide enough and the doorways are wide enough, that people have often not think about roll under sinks and other things that make it even more truly accessible, right? So you can get into the bathroom, but if you can't get into the bathtub, what's the point? Finding that is, I think, just incredibly difficult. Working with a physical therapist, a PMR that can come into the home and assess, do we need some type of chair or lift to get you into the tub? How do we think about in your home how to make it accessible? And that's usually through state-run agencies, because that's where the funding comes from. How does one support themselves on SSI? This is a question that I'm not really sure how to answer, honestly. I have found that some of the community-based agencies, some of the, in Massachusetts, we have a few like certificate programs at local community colleges. They sometimes have resources. I have a lot of young adults who live with a roommate because it allows them to pool their money, which allows it to go further. And there's some places that are extraordinarily expensive to live in. And I've also found that things like Section 8 housing, supports, and vouchers they're hard to come by, especially for wheelchair accessible housing. So I think this is like a twofold kind of answer. One is that we, as a group of people who care about individuals with spina bifida, need to do a better job of advocacy. And then the second part of it is that we need to make sure that we're using the resources that are available to us through our state. So call your local representative and say, like, I don't have access to the public library. This is a major issue. It's a government funded entity that I should be able to access. How do we change this? And see what resources they can offer you. And but it takes a lot of phone calls and a lot of advocacy work, which is hard. It's hard for anybody to have to do this. And it's totally unfair that we have to do it to begin with. Okay. Juanita also said you can send her an email. She has more strategies. As our teens transition into adulthood, what are other areas of struggle aside from the self-advocacy? So that's a huge piece. I think around that, most of it is adjusting to a new set of routines and planning for emergencies. So what do we do if? It's really hard to go through all of the possible scenarios that people may experience because it's scary. Like, we don't want to talk about all the bad things that could potentially happen, but we need a backup plan to account for this. So if we're living paycheck to paycheck, we don't have a backup plan of extra funds. We need to think about that. So to come up with a routine and then the emergency backup plan, I think is really important. One of the things I mentioned during the last call was things like using flashlights instead of, candles for safety during storms, because knocking over a candle is pretty easy to do. Knocking over a flashlight is not a fire risk. So like thinking ahead of what the other potential factors are and how to be prepared for things that we're not really prepared for and think about. Let me see the next slide. Sorry, it's 7:44. I'm a little worried I'm going too slow. Okay. As a parent, how does one ever let go? So you don't. I have still not received my parenting manual, but I'm 100% confident that how much I love my kids is not going to dramatically change as they get older. What I'm responsible for in the day-to-day lives of my children does have to change if I want them to be as independent as possible. And so that onus is on me as an adult. I feel that one of the things that we see for patients with spina bifida specifically is that oftentimes one of the parents, especially very early on, needs to stay home, whether it's catheterization needs and they can't find daycare, whether it's the gazillion appointments that kids have in the first couple years of their lives. And everything comes focused on how do we address all of the current medical needs of this young adult or of this, child, toddler, as they're going through growth and development. It's very hard then for us to back up and say, what other things am I going to add into my life to where providing care to my child is not the number one need anymore? Because we still have to drop everything when something happens. If they wind up hospitalized, if they have a surgery, like we still have to do those types of things to show up then and provide the support that people need. And so we need to be ready to drop everything, but we need to start reintegrating things into our lives as parents so that it doesn't become micromanagement of the young adults that we care about. I think that a lot of the things that are listed on this page, like where do I find programs that help pay for things? How do I understand special needs trusts? Again, some of those local agencies, and I think now post-COVID, there's a lot more opportunities for virtual lectures are sometimes helpful to learn a little bit more about these different types of services. So I know Juanita has some resources for finances and things like that. In terms of getting coverage in the home, I think, again, it goes back to like what types of support we need. If your young adult is able to make decisions, is aware of what care needs to be provided, and is able to keep track of what needs to happen, but is physically not able, then that's someone like a PCA or a personal care attendant. Those people can be, and they're not paid extraordinarily well, but there is payment available for that. There's even payment available for guardians if an adult is not able to serve as guardian of their child, or a sibling needs to do it later on. Sometimes our healthcare insurance policies will provide some limited funds for a guardian. So there are ways to get reimbursed for things. If we need more care, like in-home nursing, then we need to apply through different state agencies. Some of this depends on the level of care and what state agencies you're involved in. So I would always go back and start there because each state works a little bit differently. There's some states that provide a lot more in terms of services than others. And some of this is going to be location specific. In the state of Massachusetts, if the young adult has pretty significant medical needs, they're typically followed by the Department of Developmental Services, and they can provide more support around housing, access to nursing supports, things like vocational supports and things like that. If that's not sufficient, we go back to primary care and we ask of them for supports in the home and see what their office is able to do. The idea of the medical home, especially in adult care, is that there's a social worker there. There are other resources available in the clinic that can help with the identification of supports and the provision of supports, the help with the paperwork, the case management types of things. And again, if you're getting your adult care through a hospital system, you're much more likely to find a group of social workers or other people who can help you with some of this. How can my son get assistance in college for some of his medical needs while he attends? So this depends on where you go to school. And this is something that when you're taking tours, I would always ask about. There are some universities that have their own medical care centers. Larger state universities that may have a medical school attached might have a teaching hospital attached, and it's a part of the institution. Some of them have a small clinic, and that's it. The first thing we should do as a medically complicated young adult is self-identify. Find the clinic, find out what they're capable of doing and not capable of doing. Find out where, if you have a medical emergency on campus, you'd get transported. And then figure out, if you get transported to this facility, what can they offer and provide? What types of care should you establish there as a baseline? What types of records should you provide in advance in case there's an emergency? Do you live within driving distance? So if we suspect there's a problem with a shunt and we need urgent care, we should not be getting on an airplane. But if you live an hour away, that drive may be okay. And thinking about, like, what do I need to have in terms of a plan and a backup plan? You can also always ask for supports through the Office of Disability Services on campus, and they can often help with individual housing, a private bathroom, and things like that, and go through what some of the other services are on campus. So a lot of campuses have college counseling centers that can provide some support with the transition into college. And those things are just provided as a part of your tuition. And keep in mind, these are things you've all paid for already if your child is going to college. So you should be using them. This should not be like an embarrassment or something that we don't want to do. This is a service that you paid for when you paid your tuition. So we should be accessing it. My 51-year-old sister lives with her 80-year-old father. This cannot go on forever. Very true. Where can I go for assistance in finding your housing? I think that Juanita is popping things into the chat. This is, again, something where I think the more local you can start, the better off you may be. So reach out to your local Spina Bifida Association and see if they have resources, or go through whatever state-based agency where she's receiving care. And it may be that 30 years ago, mom and dad did not ask for any of these supports because they plan to provide them. But that does not mean she's not eligible for supports if the parents are not available. And this also changes for young adults who are coming of age for an adolescent. We will sometimes see that families are not eligible for SSI or disability when the young adult is a teenager, but when the young adult is on their own paychecks are looked at, and then they suddenly are eligible for supports. So these are things to think about as well. And again, at any hospital where you're receiving medical care should have offices that work on some of these types of things. Next slide. What can I expect after high school when it comes to attending to college or having a job? I cannot drive and I have a lot of medical needs. Okay, so once again, I would go back to those state-based agencies. So like in the state of Massachusetts, our vocational rehabilitation program, our voc rehab program, provides job training supports. They offer the opportunity to work with a job coach. They can help you go through and do, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Interest inventories, help determine different careers that may be a good match for you. And they can even help with funding at college. So those are things to think about. If you're going to go to college and you have a lot of medical needs, I'm assuming you mean above and beyond the kind of standard issue spina bifida care that we need for bowel and bladder management, I would look for a college that provides additional supports. I always think you should go and visit a college, always. It might be the perfect college on paper, has a great medical facility, has great single rooms and dorms. It has the program that you're interested in specializing in. And in the middle of campus, there's like this stark hill that you could never make it up in your chair. Like, we really need to see what the campuses look like. Large college campuses often provide more supports. There's more kids there that may need the supports that you may be accessing. However, they're often bigger campuses, and you might have to go a half mile to get between your dorm and your classroom. I would say the other thing to keep in mind is that there's always the option at college with medical documentation to take classes at a less rapid pace. So you can't slow down one semester, but standard full enrollment is considered 4 classes. And with adequate medical documentation of either slower processing speed or increased medical needs, you could take 2 classes or 3 classes and be considered full-time, which staves off repayment of loans and allows you to remain eligible for housing, as part-time students are often not eligible for housing. But that might be the way to start college if you have a lot of medical needs and you're worried about becoming ill or needing to be hospitalized during the semester, is not starting out full. Start out by taking 2 classes and see what that load feels like. See how well you can manage the routines. Can you stay healthy and get all of your work done? And like, how well are you able to manage your time with that level of intensity? And then if you can handle more, you can take another one. And if you can't handle as much, then maybe we live at home instead of living on campus, because that provides us with more supports. To think about it in that way. There's never all or nothing. There's always a way to work something out where we can get our needs addressed. And in terms of driving, a lot of students on college campuses don't drive. If you don't live in a city with mass transit, I would again go back to other methodologies for this. So like in Massachusetts, our state-based insurance provides rides to and from doctor's appointments as a part of the policy. And we have mass transit in Massachusetts that is not always wheelchair accessible. So there's a system that goes along with our mass transit system that can provide rides. And voc rehab and the Department of Developmental Services also can provide supports through Lyft or Uber, where you can get a ride door to door on your own terms and when you call them, and it's reimbursed by the state. So it really depends on where you live, what types of services and supports you may need or be eligible for. And again, good primary care doctor offices are going to know a lot of this information, particularly if they work with other medically intensive patients, even if they're not patients with spina bifida. So how can we raise awareness about the abilities of those with spina bifida? Doing so is important to find fulfilling careers and employment. So I think that this one is really important in so many ways. So I think Teal on the Hill is one of the best programs that Spina Bifida Association does, because it's national based advocacy and it raises awareness across the board. And having individuals show up to their government and say, like, this is something that should be provided, that we need for people to be aware that we're still being discriminated against despite our skills, is important, because that legal backing helps us. I think the second piece is that we start early with strengths that we have and using those strengths and choosing careers that are like good matches for what we are capable of doing. And this is really for all young adults. It's not specific to spina bifida, but I find that like oftentimes the educational plan or the plan from everybody is like, oh, we'll just go to college and figure it out. And that's a really expensive process to spend $200,000 to figure out what you're good at. Why not talk to individuals first about what they're good at or what you enjoy doing? I, as a neuropsychologist, meet with probably 1 to 2 people a year, maybe more, like on an official basis, where they come in, we have lunch together, they ask me about my career, they want to know more about what school looks like, what they have to do. I do a lot of training and teaching of college students. Same thing, talking about the different careers that exist. Find someone that's doing what you think that you want to do. Talk to them about how to get there and what to do, and find out if there's certain things that you haven't even thought about that may be a harder hurdle to get over or not. And then that way we're able to use our domains of strength more effectively. The resources that are available through the public schools and the formulation of transition plans, particularly around vocational selection, are really important as well. And most states have a vocational rehabilitation program that can help you find different career opportunities that may be a good match for you, and additional training or something like that that can help bridge the gap if it's not an area that you have experience in from before. Oh my gosh, we only have 2 minutes left, and I'm pretty sure this is not the last slide. Navigating work absences due to spina bifida is stressful. I would agree with that 100% of the time. Medical documentation is essential. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can always provide medical documentation. And with that and some of the other legal protections through the federal government, you can maintain your position even if you're out for a medical illness or an admission. I think what's harder is when we're having physiological symptoms that are getting in the way of us being successful at work. So we're having some issues with bowel management or other types of problems like that. That's really when we need to take the onus of seeking medical care and taking care of our issues rather than waiting for them to resolve on their own. And sometimes it is a resolve on their own type of thing. Sometimes we're sick and we just have to recover from the illness. But sometimes we wait, hoping that things will get better instead of addressing them head on. And then we have the documentation from a physician to help us maintain our job position and make sure that we're not going to lose our job for not going. And then the second piece of that is like making sure that we're doing what the medical team is recommending in order to be more successful. But I always feel like we should be as honest as possible in the beginning, because we don't want to find out in the long run that we weren't honest, and therefore we can't expect for them to meet us halfway if we haven't told them what our needs are. don't know what's next. Unfortunately, I also have to run. What can you show me the next
Hi,
slide?
so sorry. I was trying to unmute myself. So this was your last slide.
Oh,
Thank you
perfect.
so
Oh my gosh, that
thank you
was
so
really
much.
fast.
You
I
did
hope it
it.
was helpful. Um, Go ahead, Juanita.
No, thank you so much. That was it. We had like one last question, but I think we can maybe we can address it separately unless you want to try it. Do you want to try it? You said you have to go.
I do.
Okay.
I'll try it in 30
No.
seconds and do the best I can.
Okay. So what are programs or supports to equip parents to engage effectively with schools via the IEP process? Because lots of these skills can be taught with a school parent partnership via special education, since executive skills relate to independent living skills, furthering education and employment. They can be a large part of an educational program for people with spina bifida, including learning how to handle medical needs. So basically, do you know of
Yes.
any programs or supports that can do this?
So one of them is your local, what's called a CPAC. It's the Special Education Parent Advisory Council, and every school district should have one. They may not be well developed, but that's the first place that I would start. And if you don't have one in your town or your school district, look for neighboring school districts and just type in like SEPAC in Google with the name of your town and see if that pops up. Those are parents that are well trained in advocacy, know your public educational system. It's SE, Special Education Parent Advisory Council. So SEPAC. Um, so, and I feel like that's the first place to start. The second place is during those advocacy meetings. So from 14 and up, your young adult should be in the meetings with you and being able to advocate and say, this is what we want to do. This is how we want to do it. And this is the supports that we need is so important. I often find that like when we're quiet in meetings, we don't get what we want. And we're quiet in meetings when we're not prepared and don't know what we can ask for. So preparing for the meetings, having a list of wishes makes it so much easier for those meetings to be successful and for us to get what we need. Great.
All right.
I
Well,
really hope this
thank
was helpful.
But this was so helpful. Thank you so much. Sorry for the typo, and thank you
Oh,
very much, Dr. Queally. I hope that everything goes well this evening. We really appreciate you doing this from your car. And we could see we got dark all of a sudden. So thank you very much. Thank you everybody for attending, and we will see you the next time.
okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.